So talk about multiple hard acts to follow. Desperately afraid that I have nothing nearly as eloquent or profound to say as the women and men who have come before me, but I will give it my best shot. I'm here to share a series of epiphanies that I've had in my personal and professional life. And I think it's the gift and the curse of those of us who've been doing feminism all our lives, that the boundary between personal and professional is pretty blurry for me. Because I have lived what I fight, and because I love doing what I do. So it's a bit about finding a way to do that, and I think the last statement was so moving about finding a way to do it together and to back away when it's unbearable. So I have a series of epiphanies to share with you, and I need another one. And I'm kind of hoping you're gonna help with that. Somebody's in this room will help me at some point in the near future to come to my next one. So I'm gonna start with talking about the first epiphany of relevance, which is, I just remembered that I'm supposed to use the clicker. I did wonder why my first slide worked, but actually I don't want it up yet, so it's perfect. So my first epiphany was reading the UN's definition of violence against women. 1995, a few short years ago, but a pretty long time in terms of how many women and children have suffered since then and are suffering now. So it will be no surprise to anybody here that the UN definition completely supports the notion that violence against women and girls is enabled by and cited in the historic oppression of women. And it continues to be in every community that we live in. So I understood at my gut that that was true. As somebody who in 1995 had managed to leave an abusive marriage and was still trying to raise 2 children in the context of coercive control, I understood that it was my inequality that kept me trapped in that. There was nothing wrong with me, although I still, as we all do, struggle to hold on to that. So I understood that, but as a professional, I couldn't show the work in the margins. I couldn't say, well, what does that look like? If violence against women and girls is a cause and consequence of women's inequality, I steal that from Liz Kelly all the time, and if women's inequality is the cause and consequence of violence against women, what does that look like? And how do those of us who are charged with disrupting that system, where are the chinks? Where are the places that will break that system? And how does it operate on a system level, which is where I'm really nerdy, and on a daily level, which is where the services that I work so hard to support operate every day. So the next epiphany for me was when I was doing a piece of research about how a community with too few resources should try and distribute those to best meet the needs of women and children experiencing domestic and sexual violence. And I was doing a literature review. I love being paid to read things. And I came across a piece of research by a woman named Judy Posmus, who's in Jersey, as we would say. So I know you're saying, what? She says Jersey, like she comes from New York. But she lives in Scotland. So yes, I moved to Scotland 18 years ago, but I grew up in New York. And I read Judy's work after I moved to Scotland. And one of the things that she did, and that led to my next epiphany, is she did research with women who, I think it was definitely a good size number. I think it was about 400 and some. And she did this research with them to find out what things, they were women who'd been living with domestic abuse, and she asked them, what were the things that were offered them as help when they disclosed their experiences of domestic abuse? And then she asked, and they gave her about 20 things. And then she asked them to rank them. And has anybody else seen this? It's 1999, I think, is this research. You will see my email address. I'm happy to share it. And then she asked women to rank how helpful all those things that they'd been offered were. There was almost exactly an inverse relationship between what women were offered and what they said they needed to be free from domestic abuse. So I was working in a system that said the first thing a woman needs is emergency housing, because of course we don't remove him, we remove her and her children. But actually that was very low down the list for women. And guess what was in the top 5? A job, a decent job, childcare, an affordable quality house and roof over her head and her children's head, food on the table. And my epiphany was those things mapped absolutely seamlessly over the indicators of women's inequality in the world that I work in and live in. Here was that cause and consequence of women's inequality writ large. What women were saying is, yes, I might have to go into refuge or shelter. Yes, I might need to go on to have the police try and protect me. But really what I need is a decent job, childcare, food, housing. So I began to map this. So we've got the inequality equation, and now we hear what women are telling us about in their everyday lives, what actually helps them to be free from domestic abuse. And then my next epiphany, I know you're all glad to have this little personal story. So my next epiphany was the concept of space for action. Now this concept was first published from a woman in Scandinavia, and I tried to find her name before I came up here and I couldn't, but that also will be available eventually via my email address if you want it. That concept from her was picked up by Dr. Liz Kelly, who used it in London, a woman named Nell Whiting at Scottish Women's Aid took a course from, and then we have been using that concept in Scotland now for a long time. And it was about what is the thing that gets taken away from women, and what is the thing that we can do to help women. I'm going the wrong way. I should have practiced this before, huh? Okay. So when Nell started talking about space for action, she's a phenomenal trainer, if you're ever looking for a good trainer. It began to connect for me, just checking my time. It began to connect for me with those previous epiphanies. And I started thinking about how human rights and women's inequality and domestic abuse link up. Now, I know you're all saying to yourself, well, this is all very interesting, but it's quite nerdy and geeky. But actually, really, it's not, because what I was trying to figure out is, what's the answer? I want to know the answer. What do we do to stop this system? And until I could unpick it and figure out how it worked, I couldn't come to an answer. And eventually, what I wanted to do was to get people to stop talking about prevention as if it were putting in a course of healthy relationships and start talking about how we blow up this system, okay? So space for action. Why was that an epiphany? Well, think about this as all the space for someone who enjoys all of their human rights as defined by the United Nations. Okay? Doesn't mean you're rich, it doesn't mean you're hugely powerful, but it means that you have a lot of space for action to make the decisions, and the word that's been so prevalent today, the choices about what you do in your everyday life. So, guess what? There's a gender that's missing from this space, okay? There's no woman in any of the communities that we live in who enjoys this space. And there's lots of men who don't. But no women are in this space. So if you think about women, where they start here. Okay? Then if you think about all the things that happen to women and children when they're experiencing domestic abuse, sexual violence. Coercive control is the lesson that we've been working with most recently, and all the things that Davina just listed. Then you think about a woman who lives here. And if you think about the failure of our systems to honor any of children's human rights, and you think about children experiencing coercive control and domestic abuse and living with it, they're here. So this is the mechanics of how inequality reinforces abuse. And women and children resist every day. The "why doesn't she leave" is such a lie. Women and children resist every day, and they push and they push and they push. But this is where they are. These are the choices that they have. I knew I'd need this. So why does this matter? Well, if domestic abuse is a liberty crime, I want those shirts to say peace, love, and freedom. I want us to wish for more than safety. I want it to be freedom. We want to be like this, okay? So when we think about what's the most useful thing we can do for a woman who comes to one of our services, or a child who comes to one of our services around experiencing domestic abuse, it's about helping them tell us what would most expand their space for action. Maybe that's a mobile phone. Maybe it's refuge. Maybe it's going to the police with her. It could be a lot of things. It is a lot of things, and it isn't a lot of the things that she gets offered. The reason I took those epiphanies, and then we thought about that. What does she want? She wants a decent job where she and her children don't have to live in poverty, and she isn't constantly struggling with the possibility of having to return to her abuser, because then her children will have food on the table, okay? So we designed at Scottish Women's Aid what we hoped was a radical employability project. And the paradigm in this was completely different from every employability project we'd seen. The first assumption was there's nothing wrong with her. She doesn't need confidence building. She might need a driver's license course, but there's nothing wrong with her. It's the paid labor market that there is something wrong with. Okay, and then we tried to design this employability, so that women could move on a trajectory out of poverty using that paradigm. And guess what? We failed miserably because there is nothing wrong with her, and we couldn't change the employability and labor market system. But what that failure taught us is that structure around space for action was exactly the right thing, because we didn't have the tools in the toolkit to increase her space for action around employment. So what I'm going to try and end with today, first of all, to try and show you my 3 or 4 slides. So what we see is that reality for all women and children is constrained space for action. And that women and children who are experiencing coercive control and domestic abuse are completely and totally not totally, but are very much further constrained. But they're not just constrained by the behaviors of that abuser. And in fact, that abuser is just using the tools that are given to him through the process of patriarchy. So I'm going to end with, if we are serious about preventing domestic and sexual violence in our world, we have to be willing to take women's inequality out of the too hard box and make that our target. Not reduce police calls, not reduce, cases, not, any of the ways that we're measuring impact. We need to start measuring women's lifetime income, women's having access to the parliaments, to the local governments, and I'm out of time, but this is the message that we need to start taking into our schools. Thank you very much.